Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of the skeletal system. This lecture will take a look at the appendicular skeleton. It will be divided into two presentations, so you'll have part 2A, which will take a look at the upper body, and 2B, which will take a look at the lower body. As a reminder, please keep in mind that you will be needing your Chapter 7, the Skeletal System Study Guide. It will assist you with knowing which bones you'll need to recall for the exam, as well as the notable structures. So if you don't have it with you, please go onto Canvas and take a look in the Exam 2 folder, where you will find your Microsoft Word document that will become your automatic study guide as we're getting ready for our next exam. I also want to remind you that there will be no pictures on the exam. Instead, you'll be responsible for knowing the location of the specified bones as well as the notable structures. Now, last time we took a look at the axial skeleton, and that entailed knowing the bones that were involved with the skull, the thoracic cage, and obviously the vertebrate column. So looking at this illustration are all the bones highlighted in blue. And what we'll concentrate on with this lecture will be all your appendages, the appendicular skeleton, which are basically your extensions. So we're going to take a look at your arms and your legs, as well as the girdles that attach them to the axial skeleton. So here is the anterior view of the bones we'll be exploring, with obviously our emphasis will be on the khaki colored bones for the appendicular skeleton. Here's the view from the back, and as you can see, our blue highlights are back to guide your eye over to the bones we need to look at. So you can see we'll be exploring the bones of the pectoral girdle, which is basically your shoulder joints, your upper limbs, the bones of the pelvic girdle, which will be the hip joints, and then the lower limbs. All right, so let's start by exploring what it means when you see the terms girdle. Girdles will be attachment points where the limbs will be able to attach to the axial skeleton. And what we see happening is that you have two main ones that you're going to come across. You're going to have the pectoral girdle, which is found in the upper body, and the pelvic girdle, which we're going to explore in our next presentation. That one's going to take a look at the attachment point of the lower limbs. All of this will obviously attach to the trunk of the body. When you take a look at the pectoral girdle, what you're going to come across is the more common name, which is the shoulder girdle, and that will consist of two main bones, the clavicle and the scapula. The function of the pectoral girdle is going to be not only for attachment to the axial skeleton, for the bones, but also for muscles, which we're going to be exploring in our upcoming chapters. And because of this attachment point, it will also allow us for a degree of motility. So we'll be able to move the appendicular bones around. And the socket tends to be very shallow on the shoulder joint, so we do have somewhat of a restriction on the movements that we can make. So here is a look at your pectoral girdle, and what I've done for you on this illustration is I've highlighted for you the clavicle and the scapula. Clavicle and the scapula. Okay, so let's take a look at the clavicle in a little bit of detail. So looking at my study guide, it says that for my clavicle, I need to be able to describe that the location is the collarbone. And I need to be able to identify the notable structures of the sternal end and the acromial end. The sternal end will be the part of the clavicle that connects to the sternum, our breastplate, and the acromial end will be connecting to the scapula, which is our shoulder blade in the back. So let's see if we can go ahead and identify those particular sections on our clavicle. The next bone that you'll need to look at will be your scapula. For this one, we need to know that the location entails the shoulder blades. And for the notable structures, we have 3 items that we're going to have to find. The first one is going to be the glenoid cavity. That is going to involve a fossa, a little dip, and that is going to be known as your shoulder joint. The glenoid cavity of the scapula is where the head of the humerus will make its connection point, allowing for motility of your upper limbs. As for your acromion and your coracoid process, we'll be able to see those better when we switch over to the views of the scapula. So here's the explanation of the acromion. It's going to be the part of the scapula that actually connects to the clavicle, and it will actually help you form your acromion clavicular joint. And the coracoid process will be an attachment point for your bicep muscles. So here we go. Here's our little scapula. This is an anterior aspect. And if you concentrate on the left-hand part of the image, you can see that the glenoid cavity has been labeled. And if you look at the little insert all the way on the top left-hand corner, you can see how the humerus, the head of the humerus, is sitting directly into the glenoid cavity of the scapula. You will also have the acromion section, which is where it will make a connection with the clavicle, the collarbone. You can also see that on the little insert on the top left hand. And then the coracoid process, that one we'll be exploring in more detail later on. But for now, please know that it's an attachment point for your bicep muscle. Here it is from the posterior aspect. So once again, you can see that at the end of what we call the spine region, the elevated region of the scapula, you will end up with the acromion. And then sitting in front of it will be the coracoid process. And on the side of the coracoid process, you will have the little fossa, the little dip that will help you make up your glenoid cavity. All right, so let's take a look at hanging off from the pectoral girdle. What are the bones that are going to be involved in what we like to call our upper limb? And if you're looking onto our picture right here, we're going to notice that there are 3 main sections that we have to explore for our arms, and those will be our humerus, our forearm, and our hand. Our upper arm is composed of the humerus, and what we see happening here is that this is going to be the largest and the longest bone of our upper limb. So for the location, gently just know it's the top part of the arm. And when we look at the notable structures, we do see quite a few items. We're going to have to be able to explain the head, the surgical neck, the deltoid tuberosity, and the medial and lateral epicondyles. Now, the head basically indicates the top part of the humerus, and the reason this is important is because this will be the part that will connect with the glenoid cavity of the scapula. The surgical neck is the most frequently fractured part of the humerus, so I definitely wanted to be able to highlight that part. The deltoid tuberosity will actually be a connection point for the deltoid muscle, which is your shoulder muscle, or your main shoulder muscle, I should say. And the medial and lateral epicondyles, those are going to be muscle attachments that are found towards the bottom part of the humerus. And the reason I indicated funny with a question mark is if you've ever hit your funny bone, what you've hit is one of the epicondyles on the side of your arm. They call it the funny bone because it's the humerus. Ha ha, ha ha. And it's very painful because you do have several nerves that will radiate from that particular section. All right, so here are some illustrations. So you could see the humerus. Please take a look at, starting on the left-hand side, the head of the humerus, that part will fit directly into the glenoid cavity of the scapula. We have our deltoid tuberosity, which is about midway the shaft region. That is what we're going to be using for our deltoid muscle attachment point. We can also see the surgical neck if we're looking all the way to the right-hand side. The surgical neck, as I said, is the most fractured part of the humerus. And then all the way at the bottom, we have our medial and lateral epicondyles. Now, just a quick orientation note. Remember that anytime we use the term medial, it means towards the midpoint of the body. And if you see lateral, it means moving away from the body. Just for those of us who want to keep our orientations correct. Right below the humerus, we are going to have the bones that make up the forearm. And for that, we're going to have two bones we're going to come across. We're going to have the ulna and we're going to have the radius. Both of these bones will be held together by what we call an interosseous membrane, which is a connective tissue membrane that kind of wraps around and connects the radius and the ulna along their entire length. The ulna will be more of the medial side of the forearm. So you can think of it as being on the side of your pinky finger. On the ulna itself, according to my list, I need to know the radial notch, which will be the head of the radius where it's making its, the radial notch where it will make connection with the head of the radius. The radius will be more on the lateral side of your forearm. This will be on the side of your thumb. And for my notable structures, we're going to have to know our radial tuberosity, which makes a connection point with our bicep muscle, and also the ulnar notch, which will articulate with the ulna. So as you can see, you need to know the radial notch on the ulna and the ulnar notch on the radius, because that will be its connection point with each other. And here you can see our bones of questions. So you have your radius on the side of the thumb, and you have your ulna on the side of the pinky. And something that always kind of caught my eye is if you take a look at the head section of the radius, it actually makes a perfect circle. So that's one of the ways that it helps me identify the bone in my lab sections, is I always look for that nice little circle on top, and then you calculate the radius of that. For the ulna, its top section by the olecranon region and the coracoid process, that literally carves out a U for you. So it makes it easier for you to identify the ulna from the radius. Now for us, obviously, there won't be any pictures on our exam. So in our case, we're just going to know which one is located on the pinky side, which one is on the thumb side, and we're also going to be able to describe the structures such as the radial notch, the radial tuberosity, the ulnar notch, and the interosseous membranes. So here is a look at the ulna and the radius interacting with the wrists, as well as the elbows, so you can kind of see how they are fitting in together and how they're making their connection with the ulnar notch and the radial notch. Finishing up our upper limbs, we're going to have to take a look at our hands. And for that, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges. The carpals are going to be what makes up your wrist, and there are 8 bones that are found in 2 rows. You have a proximal row, which is closer to the body, and then the distal row, which is a little bit further off from the body, closer to the fingertips. And as you can see right here on your list, the bones in order from lateral to medial for the proximal row will be the scapuloid, the lunate, the triquetrum, and the pisiform. The distal row will have the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. Now, there is the saying, it says, some lovers try positions that they cannot handle. And the first letter of each word represents the particular bone in order from lateral to medial, proximal row on top, distal row at the bottom. Now, for your exam, what you want to be able to know is you want to be able to distinguish which bones belong to the proximal and which row belongs to the distal. You also definitely want to know their order from lateral to medial, for each section. So that's why I included that some lovers try positions that they cannot handle sentence into it to make it a little bit catchy and easier to remember. For our palms, we're going to take a look at our metacarpals. Those are going to be the bones that make up the palm region. We are going to notice that the metacarpals will be numbered 1 through 5, 1 representing the thumb, and then going down the fingers until we get to number 5 for the pinky. The fingers itself will be made out of phalanges, and the phalanges basically are your digits. Once again, they're going to be numbered 1 through 5, and the thumb will be represented by what we like to call the pollex. That's the scientific term for phalange number 1 in the upper limb, aka our thumb. With the phalanges itself, you will also notice that they are divided by 3 separate bones. You will have a distal, a middle, and a proximal phalange. This will come across in digits 2 through 5, and that is because digit 1, your thumb, will not have a middle phalanx. It will only have a top and a bottom. So let's take a look at this from an illustrative aspect. All right, so we can see our carpals labeled. And as you can see, you can have the distal and the proximal row fully labeled with your scapuloid, your lunate, your triquirium, your pisiform, the trapezium, the trapezoid, the capitate, and the hamate. If you look over to the right-hand side, you see the bracket for the metacarpals, the palm, and notice how they're labeled 1 through 5, 1 being on the thumb side, 5 being onto the pinky side. And then switching back over to the left side, you can see your phalanges, the fingers, and you can see the distinction between the distal, the middle, and the proximal, with the exception obviously being that of the thumb, which will only have the distal and the proximal. Now with this slide, we end our upper appendicular skeleton. So whenever you're ready, go ahead and switch over to our next presentation, which will concentrate on the lower limbs of the appendicular skeleton.